So I'm going to cover some games from day two of the norm, continuing on my video from yesterday. And I'll start with this game between Shruck and Jude. Two very strong players. Now, Shruck has been playing in Ireland for a while now, and Jude is coming over here from England to play in the tournament. And I think he is the top seed for the event. So the theme of today's games is basically pragmatism and the value of it in tournaments like this. I've played in these sections, and really what I see again and again is that the most successful players are the ones who can try to avoid mistakes the best, or to play as tightly as possible, to avoid mistakes, to keep their pieces protected, to play very solidly. And it's a very effective style because then they can just focus on exploiting the opponent's mistakes. You could imagine that playing against strong players, you need to do something creative, something you need to come up with something imaginative in order to win the game. But very often that's not the case. Really, it's about focusing on yourself and on your moves, your process. And if you're able to have a smooth process, you don't even need to be worried too much about creating chances because the chances will appear. So we'll look at this game from Jude's perspective. It began as a Sicilian, an open Sicilian, knight f6. So, of course, most of the time, players are playing knight c3, and that's an invitation to the Najdorf, it's an invitation to the Dragon, to the classical Sicilian, to kinds of Scheveningen positions. But here, Schruck played bishop d3, and this is a very trendy move. I think it was seen in the Women's World Championship. Ju and Jun may have played it. Um, and it's a way of avoiding the Najdorf, basically, because now if black tries to play a6, white doesn't really have to go for standard Najdorf positions because white hasn't committed the knight to c3. So white could change to some sort of Maroczy positions, where maybe a6 is a little bit early to commit like this. In general, though, I mean, the Maroczy positions are quite comfortable for white, so white gets to avoid the treacherous main lines in the Najdorf. So black doesn't go a6, black goes g6 and goes straight for a typical Maroczy position. So castles, bishop g7, c4. And this is the Maroczy bind. So these two pawns are binding on the square, so preventing black from breaking in the center, or at least they're going to try and do that. And if we look across the board, black's breaks are going to be very difficult to achieve because black has less space. They're kind of looking for breaks so they can get some play somewhere. F5, D5, and B5 are the breaks because that's how we contact white's more advanced pawns. But F5 will be very hard to achieve, of course, in the short term especially. And D5 also. B5 is the move black is often looking to play in the Maroczy, because if they are able to get B5 in, they can open some lines on the queen side, potentially for their major pieces, and start targeting some of white's pawns, especially on this diagonal. However, already we see white has a lot of control over the B5 square, so it's not going to be so easy to achieve this. So black starts with knight c6, and already white has a choice to make. White plays a good move here, knight e2. White wants to keep pieces on the board because they have a space advantage. So with more space, white would like to keep all the minor pieces, so that black has to suffer with these pieces sort of stepping on each other. There's not enough room really for all of black's pieces to operate smoothly. So black castles, knight bc3, and now black goes for knight e5. And here already, we're still in some kind of obscure theory, and the move for white is b3. It wasn't played in the game. But here I found an interesting idea for black that hasn't been played before, which is kind of telling us a lot about how we should be playing in these positions. Black can already play b5. So the move b5 is so important to black's idea. I mean, without b5, black is going to be rotating these pieces around endlessly and waiting for white to expand with f4. and improve their pieces, slowly build an attack. So black needs to get a break in. So always needs to be alert to the possibility of b5. Here it works tactically because knight takes b5 fails to takes, queen takes, and knight takes e4, opening up this bishop. Although this wouldn't be the end of the story, but black is equalizing. C takes b5, and black can just play it in typical Benko fashion with a6. Now if white grabs here, black can take, and take bishop takes a6. And here, even though black is a pawn down, there's two connected pass pawns on the queen side, black is just more or less completely winning. Because, say, queen d1, there's already problems here. Queen b1 trying to defend the rook, and d5, and the position is just opening up a little bit out of control suddenly. So instead, white might play like this, and the engine line goes something like this. So black tries to exchange some pieces, white gets some weak pawns, and black wins back the material with the two bishops. Probably white is a little bit better with this pawn, but it's not so much. Instead of b3, white played bishop g5. Usually this bishop on c1 doesn't really need to commit itself so early. It's a decent piece on c1. And often it goes to e3, some inclusion of h3, and it doesn't need to go too far away from home, where it might be vulnerable in case of like queen a5. But I think Shrook's idea was to follow up with f4 and play it as aggressively as possible. So to have the bishop outside the pawn chain, try to go for e5 at some point, and try and break open the position for an attack on the king side. So definitely an aggressive way to play. Black played bishop b7, very solid move. Just ready to bring the rook and try to put pressure on the c4 pawn. Rook c1, rook c8, and when white plays b3. So white is a very stable pawn chain, and they've gotten their rook off the diagonal, which should be quite nice. There's less tactics on the diagonal. Now black prepares to go for b5, so plays a6. White isn't too concerned yet and just plays h3. And here we see some of the kind of pragmatic thinking already from black. So black plays rook e8. Just passing the move a little bit, slightly improving move, just covering the e-pawn. Pretty standard. In case of knight d5, there's not going to be any knight e7 in case queen a5 comes. So queen a5, knight d5 sometimes is there. So black is just, passing the move to white. And now white makes a mistake with f4. And now black is ready to spring into action. So we're reacting to what our opponent's doing. We can take. Black is very happy to exchange one pair of pieces. And now black is going with b5. And this is working tactically, of course, because takes, then black plays in the game queen b6 check. And after the king moves, black has enough attackers on the b5 pawn. Here black has a decision to make. Probably it was quite obvious for Jude, but maybe for weaker players it would not be super obvious what to do here. But definitely it's important to exchange more pieces and to free the square for the knight. So bishop takes b5, knight takes, and again an important call here. I imagine some players would be tempted to go a takes b5 and keep the queens on the board. But black is really, really happy in this structure to play the endgame, because black has very few weaknesses compared to white, who has advanced these pawns rather far forward. So the exchange of queens would be very nice for black. The endgame, after the pawn improves to b5, there could be potential pressure on the a file against the a2 pawn, and long-term pressure against white's advanced pawns. Whereas you can imagine it would be very hard for white to target any of these pawns for a long time. And black's knight can start jumping as well. So white avoids the queen exchange, keeping some options of attacking on the king side. And black has many options. Black decides to go for d5. I mean, it's said in the Sicilian that if you get in d5, you're basically equalizing if you get it in appropriately. And this is kind of the case here. So white tries the rooks. If white takes the pawn, then they really don't have a very enviable defensive task, because this kind of endgame, again, white was going for an attack. And now if white has to start playing an endgame, all the attacking moves they played don't make much sense. They're just leaving weaknesses behind. So black is ready to start taking advantage of these. So white plays bishop takes f6. It was possible to play e5 as well, but then white is in big trouble after knight e4. Um, you can't really start grabbing things because you're getting forked. So instead, bishop takes f6 is there. Bishop takes f6 back, and then e5. But black has to retreat. Now, if white slows down a little bit, there's a danger that they're going to be in a lot of long-term strategic issues. So some e6, queen c5, queen c2. Structurally, white is exposed. And more simply, I would say that white is overextended and black has exchanged most of the minor pieces. So with the major pieces, black could be able to go in behind and collect the pawns, potentially attack white's king. So white has to rush. So white goes f5. And this is quite a nice move. Now white's try to activate their pieces. Now here black is just using some calculation. So far black hasn't had to make any crazy decisions. They're just following basic plans, playing solidly. So black grabs this pawn. It's a very critical move. But it works concretely. Because after white takes, black can take with the f pawn. And when white comes in with the check, they slide to h8. And the bishop is just defending everything. So the combination of the pawns on light squares and the dark square bishop defend the king, especially with the rook on the back rank. So white can collect this pawn. But black just retreats with bishop g7. White can go in with rook f7 here, but I think Shrook was worried about rook e8. Now the knight is going to be lost. White can play queen c7. Black would probably take, white would take. And Shrook probably saw this far, something like this. And black is probably going to hold this endgame, although it's slightly worse. If white fishes around for this pawn, then black can go active and start collecting these pawns. And it's probably going to be a draw. So Shrook, I guess, was a little bit provoked and wanted to play for the win, so played rook f2. Black came back with queen e8. There was an exchange. And now white's attack having petered out, the position having been neutralized, it's now much easier for black to play because black has the momentum. So black has succeeded in neutralizing white's initiative and is now feeling pretty good, whereas white is not really looking forward to the defensive task, having blown a more promising position earlier on. And it is a defensive task for white because this passed pawn is pretty annoying, and the bishop might be stronger than the knight on the open board. White goes g3, black plays d4. It should be said that this position is 0-0, so the engine is having no issues, but for a human it's not so easy. Black plays king g8, which is a nice move, just to prevent rook f7 and to prepare to bring the king closer to the center. Knight f4, rook e3. And now white makes a fatal mistake with rook e2. But this is really quite typical. I mean, white has to really make quite passive moves or meaningless moves like h4 or something, just do nothing and wait. But it's hard for humans to just wait and do nothing. They want to do something. They want to exchange the rooks and bring the king over or try and win the pawn. But white is realizing now after the rooks get traded that d3 is just going to queen, basically. d2, d1. The knight is not going to be able to round it up because the bishop is cutting it off. This shows how clumsy the knight can be in these positions. So here white had to resign. So the endgame in this version of the Sicilian is very promising for black. Black played very solidly, didn't really create anything, found the b5 break at the right time, kept everything safe, and just won the game through a mistake. And this has been a theme I'm seeing in a lot of games in the tournament, that games aren't really being carved out by one side, or wins aren't being carved out. Wins are just falling into people's laps because they're playing very well and very solidly. Here's another game. So we should look at this from Jason's point of view and try to understand the psychology of the collapse that happens. Because it was a game that went so well for him until it didn't. e4, e6, d3. Okay, So let's have a look at this from white side first. d5, queen e2. So this is a line I've played a lot. I played it against Adam, and is really, really nice. It scores well for white. It looks a lot like the King's Indian attack. It's not really the King's Indian attack, which is with knight d2. So there's lots of old Bobby Fischer games that go like this. The white wants to play it basically. Well, let's have a look. Knight f6, knight f3, bishop e7, g3, castles, bishop g2, c5, castles, knight c6, rook e1. White's going to play e5 at some point, so say b5, e5. White's going to attack on the king side, try to checkmate black, and black is going to attack very freely on the queen side. So it's a very, very dynamic situation, and it's an opening often used by strong players who are just looking to create a high variance game where one mistake is going to really cost the opponent. But Adam plays it with queen e2, which is quite a subtle but important difference. If black proceeds to play in the same way as we just looked at, we will get to a position like this. White will play e5, black will play knight d7, and now white will not play knight bd2, but will instead play c4 and keep the option of knight c3. And the most common way games go here, the way my game with Adam went when I played it against him, was knight b6, b3, black goes a5, and white goes a4. Now white has access to the b5 square with the knight, and has succeeded basically in closing the queen side. Having closed the queen side, it's possible white just might get a free attack on the king side, and black will struggle to create counterplay. The only option for black is to create counterplay down the d file. So here white is better, and is usually scoring quite well. Of course, Jason knew this line. Of course, I played it against him before, so he should have looked at it. And he plays the best line, knight c6. Now, if white continues with g3, black will play e5, and is just getting, a reversed version of the Pearts or the modern defense. Black is doing absolutely fine, because black has free development and control of the center. Instead, white tries to punish this and goes e5 straight away, knight d7, and g3. So black does not have the option for e5 anymore and has committed the knight to c6. This might make it a little bit harder for black to start expanding on the queen side. But black can use the fact that they have pressure on the center with f6. This is a typical break in the French to undermine white's advanced center. So the pawn gets distracted, and now black has very nice development and two pawns in the center of the board. I guess the downside for black is this pawn could become a backwards pawn. It's what we see in the game. Bishop g2, bishop d6, castles, castles, and c4. Well, okay, I say it's what we see in the game. It's what we would have seen in the game if I played d4 here, which would have been possible as well, and can follow up with c3. Black can't grab this pawn yet because the e6 pawn will hang at the end, and then the d5 pawn too. After c3, this pawn will be stuck on e6. So black is going to go for an e5 break, and will probably equalize. But white plays a more ambitious way with c4. White is trying to open the diagonal for the bishop on g2. However, white is weakening the d4 square quite significantly, so is taking some strategic risks. Here, Jason finds a very strong move, so he finds knight de5. This is really helping black to untangle their pieces. Now the bishop on c8 can come into the game, the rook can come across, and black is exchanging, which is quite nice, exchanging a very valuable knight on f3. If they can exchange this knight on f3, then they get access to the d4 square. Takes. Bishop takes. White has already played a little bit inaccurately. The engine is saying knight bd2 might be slightly better, so that they can maintain control of the d4 square. Instead, we reach this position, and here, Adam thought for a while. He had to choose between accepting the pawn sacrifice black has made, or trying to play a little bit more actively. In the game, he played c takes d5. Knight c3 was possible. Black really is unlikely to accept this pawn sacrifice because white will have the two bishops. Will have quite an easy game. They still have pressure this way. The rooks can come to the queen side, and black is probably going to struggle to defend this position. Instead, black is likely to play knight d4, queen d1, and now to reinforce the center with something like c6. Then white can continue with f4 to kick the bishop away, and bishop e3, and the game is quite balanced and complicated. Instead of this, white took the pawn. Knight d4, queen d1. Now we'll switch back to Jason's side. Jason takes, white takes. Jason plays bishop e6. So he's certainly not worried about white snatching another pawn, because this move c6 is extremely strong. If white takes the rook, then knight f3 check, king g2, queen f5. White is getting checkmated. So white wisely retreats. And now we need to assess this position. So black has sacrificed a pawn in order to establish a knight on d4. White's extra pawn is this pawn on d3, which is blockaded very nicely and could become a weakness. White is going to get pretty easy development, but is going to struggle to formulate a plan. Basically, white's just going to try to nullify the pressure on the d file and try to exchange pieces on d4. But it's going to be very difficult for white to remove the clamp black has in this position. Black has a lot of positional benefits here and the potential to make an attack, because since black has so much control in the center, it might be easy to start an attack. However, if black doesn't prove their advantage and things fizzle out, black will be material down. So Jason played queen g6, eyeing up the d3 pawn. White played knight c3, rook d8, bishop e4. I wasn't such a huge fan of bishop e4, but white had a clear idea of how they wanted to consolidate their position. White was thinking, if I can get bishop e4, f4, put a rook on d2, and maybe put a queen on g2. It's hard to imagine all those moves, but if they get all of those moves in, the bishop comes out somewhere, the rook comes across, then they have a very, very compact situation. So it's good to try and imagine this far ahead to see what position you're aiming towards. A position where all the pieces are defended, everything's in the game, everything's as sturdy as can be. For black, it's not so easy to understand because black's pieces are already on ideal squares. So black needs to try to create something, but struggled in the game. Because bishop e4, bishop f5, f4, bishop f6, bishop e3. Now black needs to reinforce the knight and did so at c5, which is a good move. Rook f2, b6, a good move, just creating a pawn chain. Rook d2. So white is very clear on what they want to do. Queen f1, queen g2, rook d1. It's easy for white just to shuffle the pieces into the correct place and ask black what they intend to do. This is where Jason started to go wrong. In situations like this, where you have such control in the center of the board, and your pieces are all on ideal squares, this is really where you need to use your pawns to create weaknesses, because white has no weaknesses really at the moment. They've consolidated the d3 pawn. But black has the freedom to create a weakness. Usually, you can do this with your wing pawns, because you can push them forward without incurring that many weaknesses, because they don't control so many squares. So here h5 would have been a very nice move. It's just turning the screw a little bit, making it more difficult for white, because if white continues with the plan as normal, then black's just going to put the pawn on h3. And in positions like this, if white just plays passively, black gets to a situation like this, with maintain control on d4, and has the pawn on h3. It means in any future variation, there's always going to be an issue with queen g2 checkmate or with some back rank problems. And this isn't going to go away. So white's options are narrowed a lot of the time here. There's also some very weak light squares now that the light square bishops have been traded. So this position is really unpleasant for white, although it's going to continue for a while. White is struggling here. Of course, white can defend better after h5, but black is doing something active, so it's becoming more difficult. For example, king g2 is a natural move, then h4 anyway, and h3 is certainly on the way. Really, the position is not too much better for black. It's only a little bit better for black. But black has to play so accurately to prove this advantage. King h8, queen f1. Here was Jason's last chance to play for advantage, but it was very difficult. We'll see the nuances here, how difficult it is for black to play. You would imagine that the position should be easier for black to play because of the positional compensation black has, but it's not really the case. Perhaps black can just shuffle and not do very much, but black went c4 because you feel as black that you need to go for something. You need to punish white for playing like this. Instead, black needed to play queen h5. This is a very subtle move. We're creating the threat of bishop takes e4 and knight f3 check. White should probably retreat the bishop, but now c4 is much stronger because we're threatening bishop takes d3. We'll see the difference in the game because c4 here doesn't create much of a threat after rook a d1, bringing the final piece into the game. Bishop takes d3 is not there. Black can take the pawn, like what happened, but now after white takes and goes bishop f2, white's going to collect this d3 pawn, and black has just been tricked by white. White has tricked black into exchanging the c5 pawn for the d3 pawn, and that is a huge achievement for white, because the d3 pawn was the bane of white's existence. It was a weakness that was limiting all of white's major pieces. Now black is basically panicking and realizing they have to defend. Here he makes a very good decision, I think, to take the knight, because the queen and knight combination should be quite effective, and the bishop for white doesn't look too strong. It's controlling dark squares, but so are the pawns near the king. So white could be very weak on the light squares. Here black switches with queen e6, and the game gets extremely sharp. a4, queen e4, rook d3, queen d3, and queen a4. So black has equalized the material, but white has an initiative with the major pieces. It should be said, queen takes f5 here does not work because the queen takes d1 check. Otherwise, there's some problems for black. So rook e1, queen c6, rook e5, queen g6, queen d7. Again, white hasn't really done anything too crazy here. They're just activating their pieces in an open position. Black is now worried about the a7 pawn, but can keep things under control just by addressing a tactical vulnerability. In the game, black played king g8, which was not a very useful move, because after queen takes a7, knight h4, going for some counterplay, white has this annoying check, and the black king has to go back to h8. And now in the game, white is really just cleaning up. There were some mistakes along the way, but in the end, black just lost a piece. Black could have kept excellent chances by playing h6 here. And now the game remains very sharp, because after queen takes a7, which I'm sure would have been played, knight h4 comes, and it's not so easy. There's no queen a2 check here, and black has no back rank issues. Black is threatening queen b1 check. The line I looked at is queen e7, because knight f3 check doesn't capture the rook, because white will take here with check. So black goes check, and knight check, king f1. Again, we can't touch this, because this is falling with check. So black has to defend the rook. The position remains extremely sharp. White is still a pawn up, but white's king is quite weak. Really, I can imagine this game going either way. It still feels very possible to me that black might win the game, because white's king is so weak, and white's bishop is not particularly useful in defending it, since the light squares are the weakness. But we saw white really just had a very nice plan to consolidate the position. Even though the position was very ugly, white found, if we switch the board, here, a very clear development plan. Putting the bishop on e4, the pawn on f4, bishop e3, and then this very nice move, rook f2, to bring the rook to d2. And then the rook can defend here, cover laterally, queen to f1, the rook to d1, the queen to g2, and suddenly white is very harmonious. So really, White was only focusing on this part of the board for most of the game and on getting their house in order, just organizing everything. Playing chess this way is just like trying to organize a suitcase, just trying to fit everything in neatly. And that was enough really to win the game. White didn't create anything. They took a pawn, they consolidated their position, and Black failed to capitalize on their initiative. So these two games were really challenging the idea that it's easier to attack in chess. Maybe it just depends on your style or your psychology. But really, what seems to be valuable in this event is avoiding mistakes. And that's a really internal process. It's not really related to your opponent. It's just related to your own form, your own discipline, your own approach. But okay, we'll look at some more games in the next day.